World War I saw exceptionally rapid development in the destructive potential of aircraft. On Christmas Eve 1914, there was outrage in Britain when the crew of a German seaplane dropped a mortar bomb on Dover. But by the summer of 1917, Gothas were flattening parts of London's East End with half a ton of bombs per aircraft. It wasn't just destruction on the ground that concerned commanders in the war's aftermath. The Gotha was not alone in carrying aloft a battery of machine guns with which to defend itself from intercepting fighters. A bomber both outgunned a contemporary fighter and was arguably more maneuverable at altitude. In the early 1920s, leaders in the UK, France, Italy, and the USA therefore came to the conclusion that a formation of heavy bombers could mass such firepower that a fixed-gun, single-engined fighter would not be able to stay on target long enough to inflict fatal damage without being shot down itself. This, in turn, led to a range of, in hindsight, quite outlandish suggestions about how a country's cities could be defended from waves of airborne battleships. Douhet's ideas were as yet unpublished outside Italy, but that didn't stop others concluding that the only way to attack a battleship was with another battleship. The first steps in this direction in the UK were in a 1924 specification that called for a heavy twin-engined aircraft with 3 crew, capable of 150 miles an hour and armed with a pair of Coventry Ordnance Works 37mm automatic cannons. These 200-pound weapons, better known as cow guns, provided enough firepower to outrange and obliterate a bomber as the interceptor flew in formation below and alongside. Neither the resulting Westland Westbury or Bristol Bagshot entered service. The former was too pedestrian, the latter was both too lightly built to cope with the cowgun's vicious recoil, and it had a braced semi-cantilever monoplane wing with the torsional rigidity of wet newspaper. Towards the end of the decade, the cowgun concept would make a comeback, with both Westland and Blackburn producing single-seat fighters equipped with a single fixed cowgun, elevated upwards at 55 degrees and aimed using a periscope sight. Again, neither aircraft was taken up for production. With heavy armament proving problematic as a solution to the dangers of waves of German bombers suddenly appearing over the Channel coast, other ideas began to emerge. Before I get to them, it's worth saying that although they get a terrible press, neither the RAF or the political establishment were naive to the nature of the threat or where it was likely to originate. Deep down, they knew that Versailles had been a mistake and that the Germans would seek vengeance. The form and timing of their resurgence were initially unclear and later denied through disbelief and what we'd probably today call cope. The idea of an upward-firing machine gun had also been prominent during the First World War. British aces like Albert Ball had regularly used a Lewis gun attached to the top plane of their biplanes on a Foster mounting in sneak attacks on German observers. Approaching unseen from the blind spot below and behind the enemy, a short burst at close range finished the job. Knights of the Sky it was not. While the cowgun fiasco was playing out, the Air Ministry commissioned another experimental aircraft under specification 2724. It was a single-place, twin-engined monoplane fighter made by Boulton-Paul, called the Bittern and designed by J.D. North. The general concept was quite innovative for the mid-1920s, but what made the Bittern most interesting was its armament. Revolving barbettes were fitted on either side of the cockpit, each containing a single 303 Lewis gun. These could be pointed upwards at 45 degrees and aimed using a ring and bead sight that rotated with them. 2 prototypes were built, powered by 230 horsepower Armstrong Siddeley Lynx 7-cylinder radials. Only the second prototype had barbettes. In the end, the Lynxes, which were in effect half of a Jaguar radial, lacked the power for a 4,500-pound aircraft. Maximum speed was just 145 miles an hour, and, typical of contemporary monoplanes, the Bittern also suffered from severe wing warping, which almost totally negated the action of the ailerons and made the aircraft leaden at best, uncontrollable at worst. Although they had failed to acquire a bomber-destroyer during the 1920s, the RAF remained committed to the concept. Experiments involving the RAF's one squadron of multi-engined bombers, 101 Squadron, flying the Boulton-Paul side strand, demonstrated that the RAF's Siskin fighters struggled to engage through the bomber's nose, dorsal, and ventral defensive machine gun positions. In the aftermath of the tests, Wing Commander A.C. Maund was appointed to lead the flying operations component of the air staff. His assessment was that single-seat fighters were unsuitable for dealing with formations of bombers. Although a formation of fighters might be able to break up the formation of bombers if it engaged in a formation attack, the difficulty of remaining in formation while firing on targets would likely lead to collisions amongst the attacking force, limiting their effectiveness. In October 1931, he outlined a scheme called the Bright Ideas Fighter, in which aircraft companies would be invited to respond to a broadly stated set of requirements in whatever way they felt right. A certain Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding was amongst those consulted about this idea. His view was that industry was unlikely to come up with anything the RAF hadn't, but the tender went ahead anyway. The 1932 competition was named Suggestions for an Improved Form of Fighter Aircraft, and it had the following criteria. Fighters flying in formations should be able to open simultaneous fire on bomber formations and to sustain the fire until the hostile formation were destroyed. The armament layout should be capable of deflecting hostile formations away from their course. It should also allow the attacking fighters to open fire from as many directions as possible with the minimum of preliminary maneuvers. The fighters should be able to successfully engage hostile fighters as well as bombers. An adequate margin of performance in top speed, climb, and maneuverability over contemporary bombers would be required. The ability to operate by night and day was required, carrying the equipment thought necessary for nighttime operations. Movable guns should not be obstructed in their freedom of fire by parts of the aircraft, such as the tailplanes. And the armament fitted should be capable of operation under all conditions. Unsurprisingly, there were a lot of quote-unquote bright ideas submitted, which were whittled down to 5. Of these, one for an 8-gun biplane fighter submitted by Wing Commander Thompson of the Armaments Branch was rejected on the basis that the 8 Vickers would be too heavy. In hindsight, though, Wing Commander Thompson was bang on with the solution. The other 4 entries were for turret fighters, with the emplacement either in the nose or on the dorsal spine. A fully covered turret was required because the speed of modern fighters made it impractical to operate a machine gun from an open position in the airflow, let alone hit anything. Bombers had already begun to move to turrets, and 2 British manufacturers were working on power-operated units for this purpose. Of these, Boulton-Paul were developing a turret with a pneumatically powered rotation and manual elevation to install on the nose of their side strand. The weapon inside was a single Lewis gun, and the gunner's seat would tip with the vertical motion of the gun using hydraulics. Although functional, it had severe limitations due to the size of the pneumatic reservoir, which only allowed for 20 revolutions of the turret. Nash and Thompson were also developing a hydraulically powered turret for installation on the back of a Hawker Demon, then one of the fastest combat aircraft in service. Neither of these ideas was operational by the time of the Bright Ideas fighter down selection, but both were well known in the Air Force. The competition led to a pair of wildly impractical designs, one from Wing Commander Maund himself, that was a tailless swept-wing aircraft with a pusher engine configuration and a spherical turret in the nose. The other, from the Directorate of Technical Development, had 2 Napier Rapier engines, also driving pusher propellers and a large 52-foot wing. Based on this wacky paper exercise, the committee assessing the process recommended that industry was tasked to produce a 2-seat experimental fighter with a turret in the front. Specification F533 was drawn up with this in mind. As head of the Air Ministry's Supply and Research Division, Dowding was reluctant to accept this conclusion, as he believed that such an aircraft would be easy meat for any proper single-seat fighter, but he felt that he had to go with the committee's decision. Then in May 1933, Sir Edward Ellington became Chief of the Air Staff. One of the many things on his to-do list was to make some decisions based on the previous 3 years of debate on the form of new fighter aircraft. His deputy, Air Vice Marshal Ludlow Hewitt, authored a report that firmly ranked the 2-seat bomber-destroyer at the bottom of the priority list. But Ellington was another senior leader who believed that bomber formations would be immune to attack by single aircraft, and that formation attacks would be required. For some reason, he also believed that fighters would need to fight enemies from ahead or to the rear. they would need a pilot and a gunner. This thinking was also fashionable in France at the time. Because he was in charge, everyone had to listen to Ellington, and a new specification called F-2233 was drawn up. This was for a fighter with nose and dorsal turrets. The original F-533 was for a fighter with just the dorsal turret. The following year, experiments with larger batteries of guns and the adoption of the 303 Colt Browning machine gun to replace the Vickers and Lewis guns led to F-534 for an 8-gun fighter capable of over 275 miles an hour. But the 8-gun fighters did not spell the end of the turret fighter. On the contrary, multiple manufacturers put forward ideas. Boulton-Paul was somewhat advantaged in that they'd been looking at turret designs for at least 3 years by this point, and had actually installed their Type 1 turret on the Overstrand bomber. Their P-76 proposal therefore had a single Overstrand turret in the nose, and a pair of Vickers machine guns in the rear fuselage pointed upwards in Schlager music fashion. 2 size and power options were offered. A 47-foot 6-inch span version with a pair of 350 horsepower Napier Rapier 5 engines, or a 58-foot 6 variant with 700 horsepower Bristol Pegasus 4s. The P-74 was related to this, but also had a dorsal Type 2 turret, which was pneumatic, but it was glazed only on the upper section. A single Lewis gun was in the dorsal turret. Various variations on these themes were proposed by other manufacturers, but in keeping with all of the other responses to F-2233, they were met with lukewarm response by the Air Ministry. Even Ellington apparently came to the belief that a fighter version of the new Wellington bomber would be preferable to those 230-mile-an-hour hybrids. At the time, he was also starting to get his first turret fighter squadron when the turret-equipped Hawker Demon entered service in February 1933. Ultimately, 108 of these were acquired, 59 of which were actually built under subcontract by Boulton-Paul Aircraft Limited, which had recently been spun out of the conglomerate and moved to Wolverhampton from Norwich. Actually, although the airframes went into service in 1933, the FN-1 turrets for those Demons weren't ready until 1936. They were manufactured by Parnell. Early experiences with the aircraft when they were just equipped with scarf rings was that the pilots tend to simply fly them like single-seaters, with the back-seater adding a few bursts as the pilot broke off. This form of employment, which continued when the turrets were added, eliminated the point of the extra weight and size that came with the movable weapon. Disappointment with the way in which crews were using their new weapons was the main reason that the Air Ministry elected to remove forward-firing guns from their next turret fighter, thus forcing the pilots to do what they were told. Rapid technological advancement meant that powerful new engines and compact, powerful Browning machine guns were now available. In turn, this led to the air staff homing in on a single-engined, 2-man aircraft with a single dorsal 4-gun turret. High speed via low drag and heavy firepower through the turret could therefore be combined into a single package. Arguments about whether this configuration would allow for a diving attack were eventually resolved, and specification F935 was approved on the 20th of May 1935. F1035 for an 8-gun single-seat fighter was issued alongside it, leading to the Hurricane and the Spitfire. The new specification called for a top speed of 298 miles an hour at 15,000 feet, which was only 15 miles an hour short of that required for the single-seat fighter. Service ceiling was 33,000 feet. The climb to 15,000 feet needed to be done in 5.5 minutes, and endurance was pegged at an hour and a half when cruising at 253 miles an hour. The turret was to be power-operated and able to fire over the entire upper hemisphere, plus as much of the lower hemisphere as possible. A bomb load of 8 20-pound bombs was to be catered for if there was a sudden need to provide close support to the army. Boulton-Paul had already moved towards readiness for this new specification by signing a deal with SAM, a French company with a new turret design that J.D. North had encountered on a sales visit. The SAM AB-7 held 4 belt-fed Dana machine guns in an electro-hydraulic turret. The French government was uninterested in the design as they were attempting to standardize fighter armament on the 20mm Hispano cannon. North immediately recognized that the AB-7 was better than his own designs. Because it had its own hydraulic pump, it required only electrical power from the host aircraft. Boulton-Paul paid 150,000 francs for 2 turrets, and an option on the rights to exploit all of SAM's patents on turrets. Apparently, they beat another British manufacturer to the prize by just 24 hours. In April 1937, the option was vested for 250,000 francs plus legal expenses. Boulton-Paul now had the rights to sell a range of turrets throughout the Empire and Commonwealth, paying a £50 royalty on the first 125 turrets. A veritable bargain. JD North now had his turret, but now he needed to design a plane to put it in. The internal designation for that effort was P.82, and it needed to get a move on. Boulton-Paul had the best turret design, but others, including Hawker, were well ahead on airframe design, which they had based on their Henley light bomber. The Henley also was going to use the Merlin engine, and it could take lessons from the parallel Hurricane project. Its turret was a retractable unit developed by Nash and Thompson. Fairey were in the process of modifying the Battle in a similar manner. Supermarine had their own elliptical wing fighter, as you might expect. Bristol, the innovative, almost American-looking Type 147, and so on. Further urgency was injected by the Air Ministry, which ordered prototypes of 5 different aircraft in October 1935. This was accompanied by some revisions to the spec to increase internal fuel tankage, but that had little impact on Boulton-Paul's process. 2 of their P-82s were ordered. P-82 had a relatively streamlined, light alloy skinned fuselage and a sort of elliptical wing that offered some of the advantages of that shape but was much easier to construct than that of the Spitfire. The skin was flush riveted onto the tubular steel frame to improve aerodynamics, and the Defiant was in the main well suited for mass production as it was bolted together from different sub-assemblies. This made it easy to subcontract different bits to different suppliers across the Midlands. The wing and forward fuselage sections were made separately, with the cockpit unit attached to the completed wing section that contained the fuel tanks. The tanks were not self-sealing as delivered, but self-sealing tanks were later retrofitted. The rear fuselage consisted of 3 pieces brought together to form a triangular structure so that these 2 could be built separately, and then assembled later. A great deal of testing was done in Boulton-Paul's on-site wind tunnel to perfect the configuration. Few manufacturers had this kind of facility, a benefit of the company's relatively recent independence. As you'd expect, the landing gear was retractable. Initially, a retractable tail skid was fitted, but this was switched for a fixed wheel before production began. In production aircraft, the landing gear hydraulics and the main gear legs were made by Lockheed, as the British Doughty system had proved unreliable in the first prototype. Because the main gear was widely spaced, the aircraft was nice and stable on landing, particularly compared to the Spitfire. In production, power came from a Rolls-Royce Merlin III, which gave 1,030 horsepower and initially drove a 2-speed propeller. From the 87th production aircraft, a constant speed prop was fitted, improving the climb rate. The Merlin's ventral radiator gives the Defiant a superficial resemblance to the Hawker Hurricane, and would confuse some Luftwaffe pilots. The gunner accessed the turret through 2 sliding doors at the forward end. His seat had no backrest, and he had his feet in stirrups or on a swivelling bar. 4 Browning machine guns in pairs, one above the other, were on each side. Ammunition was on belts contained in boxes. The gunner had to manually switch belts when one was expended, but a simple loop of cloth that connected them together meant that the end of the next belt was immediately to hand. When in his place, the gunner operated the turret with a single control handle that had a fire button on the top. The motor had a high-speed mode for really fast tracking, and if it failed, there was a manual crank handle for all the good that would do. As the turret passed through the centre line, pneumatically actuated wooden fairings popped up to reduce drag caused by the gap. An electrical cutout prevented the gunner shooting the vertical or horizontal tails off. If he needed to get out in a hurry, there was a hatch on the bottom of the turret, although with a parachute on, it was a very tight squeeze. Incidentally, the Defiant's pilot also had a gun-firing button on top of the control stick and could fire the weapons if the turret was pointed and locked into the forward position. There was no synchronization, so there was a strong possibility that doing so would shoot the propeller blades off, but that's the price of feeling like a proper fighter pilot. The turret fired its guns on a ground-based cradle for the first time in October 1936. Boulton-Paul also ordered an example of Sam's new AB-15 turret with the 20mm Hispano to test that out, as they anticipated the Air Ministry changing to that weapon. It would eventually be fitted to the first prototype, but never ordered. Having the turret meant that the Defiant's radio aerial had to be relocated under the fuselage, between the wheel wells. An automatic retractable antenna was then added in the second prototype, and the production aircraft to supplement it. The retractable unit was quite unpopular because it didn't automatically retract when the wheels were lowered and thus tended to be snapped off on landing. A first flight was due on the 4th of March 1937, but was delayed when a visit from the Air Ministry required hasty bolting on of various bits and pieces to make the prototype look more advanced than it was. Taking them off took time. Even without the first flight, on April the 28th, 1937, Boulton-Paul received an order for 87 aircraft, to be named the Defiant. At this stage, the Defiant was the backup plan to the Hawker Hotspur. 389 of those have been ordered. The other 3 contenders were cancelled. In a strange twist of fate, Boulton-Paul were also awarded a contract to build Blackburn Roc turret fighters for the Fleet Air Arm. In May, the Defiant's prototype's wings were mated to the fuselage. A test flight was getting closer. Engine run-ups were made in July, and high-speed taxi tests began on the 11th of August, with the turret position fared over and the unpainted aircraft polished to a shiny finish. A short hop was made for the first time that day, but was curtailed by an oil leak from the propeller hub. The Defiant flew well, though, validating the wind tunnel tests. The AB-7 turret went aloft in the nose of an overstrand during the same period to fire at targets pulled along by a Hawker Hart. Those tests also went very well. It was also in this period when the 4 machine gun turret received the designation Type A. Everything appeared to be coming together nicely. In testing, the Defiant performed really well. Without the turret holding it back, the aircraft was capable of 320 miles an hour. Handling was so good that a proposed 2-seat trainer with the turret removed for an extra pilot's position was cancelled, 80% complete. It was also so good that an additional 202 aircraft were ordered in January 1938, aided by the fact that competition for resources with the Hurricane meant that the Hotspur was slipping behind schedule. Its first flight didn't take place until the 14th of June 1938. As production neared, some detail changes were made to improve sealing of the cockpit against drafts, add a heater and a non-slip mat on the wing to make it easier to get aboard. The heater worked by drawing air over the engine radiators, but was to be supplemented in practice by electrically heated suits for the pilot and gunner. As it happens, it wasn't until February 1938 that the turret was finally fitted to a Defiant prototype. In its final configuration, the turret weighed 850 pounds, including 2,400 rounds of ammunition, raising the aircraft's weight to 7,500 pounds. A Hurricane came in at 6,300. Boulton-Paul remained very confident and upbeat. On the 5th of May, the Air Council Committee on Supply asked when they could expect their fighters. The firm replied that they would have 450 ready for operations by March 1940, despite having produced a grand total of 0 thus far. They also pointed out that they had actually only taken orders for 289 aircraft, which resulted in an additional order for 161 being placed. With so much going on, someone must have forgotten that order form. It wasn't until October that the Defiant prototype, now complete with turret, was sent to Martlesham Heath for service trials. The turret had reduced top speed to a still acceptable 303 miles an hour at 15,000 feet, but the climb rate to 20,000 feet was now a rather pedestrian 20 minutes. This was where the added weight really told. A Mark I Hurricane was only 15 miles an hour faster in level flight, but it climbed 20,000 feet nearly twice as fast. There wasn't much that could be done about that, though. Another concern were the pneumatic fairings. If the gunner rotated the turret too much, then the aircraft's engine-driven compressor could not replenish the pneumatic reservoir fast enough. This, in turn, would mean that the wheel brakes would no longer function on landing, which would make landing very difficult. The testers recommended fitting a button that allowed the gunner to lock the fairings down for the duration of combat, albeit at the cost of 6 miles an hour of top speed. The second Defiant prototype was rolled out and then flown on the 18th of May 1939. It had numerous small changes and was the pattern for the first production aircraft, which flew on the 30th of July. This was the test aircraft for the bomb racks. Only one aircraft actually made it to the RAF before Britain's declaration of war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939. During tests over Boscombe Down on the 20th of September 1939, the fourth production Defiant was flown against a Blenheim Mark IV. The bomber, despite being the fastest available, could not shake off the fighter unless it descended to very low level, where the Defiant's guns couldn't hit it. This resulted in a small modification that traded 7 degrees of elevation for 7 additional degrees of depression. With this change made, the Defiant was judged ready for war. 264 Squadron was tasked with bringing it into service. 264, incidentally, was also known as Madras Presidency Squadron, in a touch of imperial grandeur. To start with, 264 had to do with Miles Magisters and Fairy battles, as there were no Defiants. 3 Defiants then turned up at the start of December, followed by 6 more by the end of the year. Although the Defiant gets a bad press, it was very sophisticated for the time. Most of 264's pilots had never flown a monoplane nor one with retractable undercarriage, so there was a great deal to get used to. A dozen pilots were nonetheless ready for action by the end of the year. Many of the gunners were New Zealanders, trained as air observers in that country and then shipped to the UK. The practice was to assign a pilot and a gunner as a lasting team so that they could establish an instinctive working relationship. The initial tactics they practiced were for a Defiant squadron to attack a flight of bombers simultaneously from each flank and behind. As was typical in the RAF at the time, they operated in VICs of 3 aircraft. The idea was that the 3 aircraft would sit to either side of a bomber at close range to overwhelm its gunners. Over time, 3 distinct attack patterns were developed in operations against Blenheims and Wellingtons. The simplest to orchestrate was an overtaking course on a parallel track. A beam attack required good coordination and geometry. A diving attack across the nose of the bombers required strong nerves. It also needed the Defiant formation to have 1,000-foot or greater height advantage as the plane accelerated poorly and couldn't zoom climb. Even though deployment to France seemed unlikely, 264's commander, squadron leader Philip Hunter, was awake to the dangers of a face-off with the Luftwaffe's Bf-109s. He therefore arranged for a Spitfire flown by Flight Officer Stanford Tuck to bounce him at the time of Tuck's choosing. The results of this test were perhaps not what you might expect. Both sides were just using their gun cameras. Hunter's gunner burned through his whole reel, and at one point the Defiant ended up on the Spitfire's tail. Tuck never got into a position to open fire. The Defiant was slower than the Spitfire and at low speeds could turn more tightly. Tuck appears to have been drawn into a turning fight, perhaps out of curiosity. It was a mistake that a good pilot would only make once. Hunter issued guidance that if attacked by fighters, the squadron was to go into a defensive circle and not allow speed to drop below 160 miles an hour, thus keeping the Defiant in its optimum speed range for turning. The pilots also practiced ground strafing and dive bombing. Brief consideration was also given to deploying Defiants as army observation aircraft to replace the vulnerable Westland Lysander, but in truth, RAF Fighter Command needed as many aircraft as it could get, and deploying them in that role was a waste. Having tried out basically every role besides strategic bombing, 264 was declared operational in March 1940 and deployed forward from RAF Wittering to Bircham Newton so they could fly patrols over convoys in the Channel. At the same time, 141 Squadron converted from Blenheim fighters to the Defiant, completing the process in May. Deliveries from Wolverhampton were still rather slow, despite another order for 150 planes being received in December 1939 and 50 in February, bringing the total order to 650. Boulton-Paul had basically expended the entire labour pool and was forced to resort to training men in Cannock in Scotland and shipping them south. A new turret factory was also under construction as demand for those from across British industry was far outstripping supply. Fewer than 100 Defiants were therefore available when Germany launched its attack into Belgium and the Low Countries on the 10th of May 1940. 264 moved to Duxford and conducted a fighter sweep alongside a half a dozen Spitfires, aimed at attacking German aircraft over Holland. After a bit of fruitless searching, the Defiant crews spotted a lone Junkers 88 attacking coastal shipping. While the Spitfires attacked from behind, red section of Defiants flew by alongside the bomber, raking it with fire and forcing it down into a field of cows. Yellow section then spotted a Heinkel 111 and repeated the process. On the 13th, the Defiants became embroiled in a large dogfight when they and the Spitfires found a group of Stukas about to attack a target. They were spotted, and the Germans sent up red flares to alert their escort that they were under attack. Some of the Stukas dived on their targets, while others seemed to have attempted to engage the British fighters with their wing machine guns. A Stuka was promptly shot down by a Defiant, which was in turn riddled with cannon and machine gun fire from one of the 27 arriving Bf-109 escorts. Both of the Defiant's crews survived, the gunner by taking to his parachute, the severely wounded pilot after a successful forced landing. 2 more Stukas then went down, both victims of Pilot Officer Thomas and Gunner Bromley. Within seconds, they were shot down by Bf 109s along with the last aircraft of Blue Section. Green Section were also heavily engaged. Green 1 claimed a Bf 109, then was downed in return. Green 2 shot down a Stuka, but less than a minute later had both wings on fire, having been hit by cannon shells. Its pilot managed to land behind Dutch lines. Green 3 fired at the Stukas, but was driven off when its guns jammed. It was the only Defiant to return to base. As a result, 264 lost 5 aircraft and 4 aircrew for 5 claimed kills. It was a chastening experience. The Defiant was excellent against the Stuka, but effectively defenseless against the Bf 109. The Germans examined the 2 aircraft that had come down behind their lines, but they learned little they didn't already know about the type. 264 received more aircraft and crews, and was back to strength in time to fly patrols over Dunkirk. On the 24th, they shot down a Bf 110 and drove off a Junkers 88. On the 27th, an unwary group of Bf 109s were apparently surprised by the Defiants, and 2 of the German fighters were shot down for no loss. Later that day, they launched a coordinated squadron attack against a flight of Heinkel 111s and downed 3. A dose of reality was administered the next day when 10 aircraft set off for Dunkirk but were bounced over the channel by Bf 109s. They went into a defensive circle, but 3 Defiants went down. They claimed 5 109s, but more likely actually got none. The peak of Defiant effectiveness was reached on the 29th of May. Again, 264 flew to Dunkirk, and again they were attacked by 109s, which came in out of the sun but were spotted by Defiant gunners, who opened up a withering fire that downed 3 or 4 Germans for 1 Defiant. Things then got very confused. The Defiants attacked a formation of Stukas, claiming 1, before being set upon by 110s and 109s. 6 Defiant gunners claimed a 110, and 3 109s were also claimed. These kill claims are highly suspect, although it does seem likely that 1 or 2 fighters were indeed shot down. Returning to Dunkirk after refueling back at base, the Defiants attacked a different formation of Stukas, this time claiming 10 of those and then a Junkers 88. Irrespective of the actual numbers, it was certainly a good day for 264 Squadron and the Defiant. The general telling of this story is that the German fighters thought they were attacking Hurricanes, went for the rear, and were surprised by the turret. While that might be the case, the majority of 264's victims were Stukas, which were uniquely vulnerable to the Defiant, which could simply fly along a formation of the bombers as they prepared for a diving attack and shoot each one down in turn with little or no risk. The Defiant's vulnerability to the 109 remained, as was demonstrated on the 31st of May when the Defiants went after a formation of Heinkel 111s and were promptly bounced by 109s, which came down on them out of the sun in near vertical dives. The first the Defiant crews knew was when shells on 109s flashed past. 2 of the Defiants collided as they attempted to form a defensive circle, and a third was shot down. They claimed 3 109s, but in reality they may have downed 1 or none, depending on the owner of the parachute spotted descending in the wake of a 109 that was streaming smoke. On their second patrol at dusk, the Defiants downed between 2 and 4 Heinkel 111s, but lost 2 aircraft to return fire from the bombers. Fortunately, the pilot of 1 Defiant was able to ditch his stricken aircraft between 2 British destroyers, and both he and his gunner were rescued. The other crash-landed at RAF Manston, and again both crews survived. There then followed a lull for the 2 Defiant squadrons. They had no role to play while the German army finished off the French, and the Luftwaffe began its preparations for an assault on Britain. There was time for a mock dogfight between a captured 109, with much the same result as that with the Spitfire before fighting started. 264, which had been very active, attempted to teach what they'd learned to 141, which was yet to fight. Use of defensive circles and spirals against fighters were emphasized. A memo was also written that emphasized the need for a bulletproof windscreen and a pair of forward-firing wing machine guns, even if the type's role remained bomber interception. 264 Squadron remained enthusiastic about the Defiant, even if others from Dowding Down had serious doubts. Both 264 and 141 were deployed right forward at an airbase in Kent, the closest field to occupied France, in an area that would become known as Hellfire Corner. At 12:10 on the 19th of July 1940, sirens went off at their base, scrambling 141 to defend a ship being dive-bombed by Bf 110s in the channel. 3 of the Defiants suffered engine trouble on the ground, leaving 3 sections to head out over the sea. The 110s had left the area, escorted by Bf 109s. The commander of the Bf 109 Staffel, Captain Troutloft, decided to use up their fuel on a fighter sweep as he had seen the 9 Defiants taking off in the distance. Coming out of the sun, he identified the aircraft as Defiants. He then stayed with them as the Defiants in turn spotted a formation of Heinkel 111s and turned to intercept. Leading his formation in, Troutloft opened up on the trailing Defiant of the last Vic at 100 metres, ignoring the tracers flashing past from the gunner. The Defiant exploded. Troutloft's wingman also claimed 1 kill on the first pass. The inexperienced aviators of 141 should have circled, but instead they flew straight and level while the 109s repeatedly dived through them, arcing back to make more passes. After a murderous minute, the 109s saw 111 Squadron's Hurricanes and disengaged. 2 pilots, including Troutloft, took engine damage and had to force land, although both of their aircraft were repairable. On the British side, 5 Defiants were shot down in that first minute. Another, flown by Flight Lieutenant Donald, was set alight. He dived to wave-top height and escaped back over the English coast, only to fly into a hill 4 miles short of his base. Of the 3 Defiants to make it back, 1 was subsequently written off. The gunner of that aircraft had bailed out in the Channel and he was never found. This incident is what the Defiant is best known for. 141 was moved to Scotland and out of the cauldron over southern England. Such was the panic in fighter command that 264, which was on its 3rd Channel patrol of the day as 141 met its fate, was ordered to return to base immediately. Fighter command almost always conducted itself coolly, and this was a rare freakout. 141 was an untested squadron, and such disasters happen to untested squadrons. In fact, Bruce Park insisted on gradual mixing in of new pilots into squadrons to avoid such mishaps taking place. Why the same care was not afforded to 141 is a mystery. There's also the reality that fighter command's leaders wanted 8-gun fighters for hit-and-run attacks. Pre-war ideas of heavy fighters engaging unescorted bombers had not come to pass. The 110 was just as roughly handled by Hurricanes and Spitfires as the Defiant was by 109s. Strangely though, another 280 Defiants were ordered in July, bringing the total order number to 930. Although its time as a daytime bomber-destroyer was over, 264 remained a good squadron, and the RAF needed every aircraft it could get. A proposal to provide a single-seat Defiant armed with 12 machine guns or 6 cannons and capable of 360 miles an hour resulted in only a single prototype and no orders. Having relocated to RAF Manston in Essex, 264 finally joined the Battle of Britain on August the 24th. That morning, they flew patrols over Manston and had 2 encounters with Bf 109s, resulting in damage to 1 Defiant but no losses on either side. Then at lunchtime, 20 Junkers 88s attacked Manston itself. 7 Defiants were able to scramble to engage them, shooting down a confirmed 5 bombers before 109s intervened and shot down 3 Defiants. 264 went into a circle, and fire from the gunners resulted in 1 109 taking damage. It collided with another Messerschmitt and both crashed. Unfortunately, one of the lost Defiant crews was that of Squadron Leader Hunter, who was killed. There was no respite. Flight Lieutenant George Garvin became acting CO. That afternoon, the remaining 9 Defiants were scrambled against a raid of Junkers 88s and Heinkel 111s coming up the Thames estuary. 2 Defiants collided on the ground, so it was once again a flight of 7 that went aloft in 2 Vics with a tail end Charlie bringing up the rear. Attacking from below, 1, maybe 2 Junkers 88s and a Heinkel were quickly dispatched, before a single Bf 109, flown by Hauptmann Gunther Lutzow, swooped on them, shooting down a Defiant at close range and damaging another before he ran out of ammunition. That aircraft's gunner was killed by Lutzow's shells. The pilot barely landed it and the aircraft was repaired. On the 26th, a similar story was repeated. Defiants attacked a formation of Dorniers, claiming 6 and definitely shooting down a Bf 109, but losing 3 aircraft in return. The 27th marked 264's last daytime action in the battle. The target was a large Heinkel raid heading for London and escorted by 80 109s commanded by no less than Adolf Galland. 4 Defiants were shot down, one of which was repaired. 264 claimed 4 Heinkels. Their 4 daylight actions therefore resulted in 19 claimed kills for 11 aircraft lost. RAF pilots typically overclaimed by a factor of about 2.1, so the real performance was 9 or 10 for 11, which is not actually all that bad. Better still, the vast majority of the Defiant's kills were against bombers, which were the only target that mattered for fighter command at the time. 264 was given a short period to recover and accept new recruits, then it was retasked to focus on night fighting. This was, of course, a mission they had trained for at the outset, but it had rather lapsed, as very few of the current squadron had been through the original training regime. 307 Squadron, consisting of Polish pilots, was also declared operational in early September, tasked with night operations from the outset. Adaptations for the night fighter role were rudimentary. The fighters were painted black. Flame dampers were installed on the exhausts. The pilot's armor plate was removed. Lower intensity bulbs were installed in the cockpit, and that was it. Some consideration was given to removing the turret entirely and replacing it with a radar observer and fitting wing aerials, but the modifications to add 12 wing guns were too extensive given that the Beaufighter night fighter was only a few months away, so nothing like that was done. Finding bombers was fiendishly difficult without a radar. 200 sorties were flown before a Heinkel 111 was shot down on the 16th of October by 264 Squadron. The kill was more by accident than design. The pilot spotted the aircraft out of the corner of his eye when the bomber was only 25 yards away. The gunner fired into the Heinkel's engines and it went down in flames. Even without encountering the Luftwaffe, these missions were dangerous. 307 lost a plane when the pilot lost situational awareness and flew into Barmouth Bay on January the 9th, 1941. Through to April 41, only 4 German night bombers were downed by Defiants. More Defiant squadrons were being set up to join the frustrating battle, though, attempting to reduce blitzes across the UK. The standard patrol seems to have been at 12,000 feet, with Defiants notified of the general location of raids by fighter direction centres. Most of the time they worked alone, but on some nights AA batteries designated altitudes in which they would not engage targets, so that squadron-sized formations could go up. About 2/3 of all sorties resulted in an attempted interception. Success was generally due to simple luck. Fires from bombing might show a bomber's silhouette from as far away as 1,000 yards. Similarly, contrails could be illuminated by moonlight and give the target away, but more often than not, the Defiant crew simply flew around and blundered into a German. Engagements were fought at point-blank range, down to 50 yards and closer. On occasions, aircraft would contact each other, sometimes with fatal results. Lack of reliability in the Defiant's turrets was somewhat unhelpful in this effort. They would sometimes rotate slowly or freeze entirely. Fuses could be changed by the gunner, and this sometimes worked, but even if the turret did work, the guns would jam from cold soaking at altitude and thus be unavailable at the critical moment. 264 scored kills at slightly over 1 a month during the Blitz from October 1940 to May 1941. Defiance in general made 6 claims until April the 2nd, 1941, then 43.5 in the renewed German air offensive of April and May 1941. Operational losses continued at a low rate throughout the period. From June onwards, the night fighter squadrons began to convert to the Beaufighter, although it was also in this month that the Luftwaffe withdrew to the east in order to support Barbarossa. 264, always the greatest proponents of the Defiant, were the last to fly it, finally giving up their tired aircraft at the end of April 1942. Defiants did remain useful to the RAF, though. The last aircraft off the production line, Mark IIs, as I'll explain in a moment, were converted into high-speed target tugs, as were 150 of the retired aircraft. These target towing aircraft were tropicalized with filters over their air intakes to fulfill demand in the Far East. Despite the time it took to come into being and doubts that Hugh Dowding and others had about the Defiant, in March 1938, Boulton-Paul received a contract for 3 improved P.92 turret fighters. One was to be powered by 2,055 horsepower Napier Sabres, the other by 1,710 horsepower Rolls-Royce Vultures. They made use of a 420mm cannon turret called the Type L, which was also envisaged as armament for future British bombers. P-92 was a twin-engined aircraft, 54 feet in length with a span of 65 feet. Fully loaded, it would have weighed 21,000 pounds, but with at least double the horsepower of the Defiant, it could still make 315 miles an hour at 15,000 feet. It had space for a crew of 3, with an observer sitting next to the pilot up front and the gunner further back. The observer was more of an option in the early stages as there weren't any controls for him, but given that P-92 was intended to have a range of 2,000 miles, a navigator was a pretty good idea. He could also potentially have operated an air interceptor radar if one was fitted. Less good was the position of the cockpit close to the nose, rather too close to the spinning propeller blades to make bailing out easy. Behind the pilot was a chute for parachute flares that could be used to illuminate a target at night, and the radio. The dorsal turret amidships carried 4 Hispano cannons, which were fed by 32-round drums. The gunner had to load these manually from 4 overhead racks. Total ammunition capacity was 480 rounds, and the guns could be fired singly or all together. A wooden mock-up was used to develop the turret and refine the general layout. Unfortunately, wind tunnel testing showed that the 5-foot-long cannon barrels protruding feet from the turret caused a great deal of drag. Boulton-Paul developed a system of floating fairings that deflected airflow and improved matters a bit, but not completely. Partly for this reason, and partly because interest in turret fighters was waning, P.92 was quietly dropped in October 1939 before a proper prototype could be built. Less ambitiously, development of a Defiant II with a more powerful Merlin 20 engine, fitted with a 2-stage supercharger, began in August 1939. This gave 1,390 horsepower with 12 pounds of boost, and was obviously better at high altitudes. Fitting it meant extending the fuselage by 6 inches and adding a pressurized fuel system, fed by an additional 27-gallon tank in the port outer wing and a 28-gallon one in the starboard. The hope was that these changes might give 345 miles an hour. 2 aircraft on the line were modified as prototypes, and the first flew on the 20th of July 1940. More tail area was added immediately after this test, but there was a delay after it was fitted because the prototype got into a taxiing accident and was damaged. When tests resumed, the bigger engine was found to give only 313 miles an hour at 15,000 feet. The Defiant order was nevertheless updated so that 210 of the final 280 aircraft would be Defiant IIs, but in the final reckoning only 7 were built. They were issued to squadrons right at the end of the type's service in March and April 1942, and were equipped with the AI Mark IV radar. Flight Officers Stewart and Maggs of 264 Squadron used the radar to make the Defiant's last confirmed kill. It was against a Heinkel 111 at about 3:30 in the morning on the 18th of April 1942. The need to replace the Defiant and the Beaufighter as night fighters was still there in the background, though, as even after June 1941, the RAF feared a renewed blitz at some stage. Smaller-scale night raids against airfields continued and remained hard to intercept, even with airborne radar. The raiders also managed to achieve an even 1-to-1 exchange rate with RAF night fighters, which was clearly unacceptable. A requirement was therefore formalised in August 1941, and it led to a torturous journey to develop a new night fighter. That, however, is a subject for another day. The general conclusion about the Boulton-Paul Defiant is that it was a disaster, an obsolete aircraft made to a misguided concept, a waste of resources. I don't think that this is the right conclusion to draw. When used for its intended purpose of attacking fast-medium bombers at medium altitudes, the Defiant was at least as effective as the 8-gun Hurricane and Spitfire. Of course, if Defiants had been mass-produced rather than those types, then the RAF would have lost the Battle of Britain. But then if the Luftwaffe had mass-produced Bf-110s rather than Bf-109s, it would have lost the Battle of France. The concept of a bomber-destroyer was a sensible one based on what was generally believed about the strength of bomber defensive armament in the 1920s and 30s. But as the speed of bombers climbed, the weight of defensive armament they could carry was traded away, and thus a Heinkel 111 or a Dornier 17 was nowhere near as heavily armed as the planners had anticipated. And, as is always referenced, the RAF hadn't planned for France to collapse. They had expected that only heavy escort fighters would be with the German bombers, if any at all could make the trip. The Defiant held its own against the 110 when those types were encountered. That, in truth, is because it wasn't obsolete. It was a 1939-era 305-mile-an-hour fighter with reasonable armament and acceptable turning capabilities. It was slow to accelerate compared to a single-seat, single-engined fighter, but no worse than a 110. When flown by the experienced pilots of 264 Squadron, it was nowhere near as vulnerable to the 109 as the 110 was to the Spitfire. As experienced pilots dwindled, so the loss rate climbed. But that was the same in the RAF and Luftwaffe single-seat fighter communities. Green pilots died at a terrific rate regardless of what they were flying. In May 1940, was the Defiant a better aircraft than the Bf-110? Probably not on a one-to-one basis, but it's worth noting that from an industrial perspective, you could build 2 Defiants with the manpower and materials required to build a single 110. So there we have it. From my vantage point at least, the Defiant is rather cruelly treated in the general assessment of early war air power. It was a conceptual failure, but not a particularly bad or obsolete aircraft by the standards of the untested ideas and types that fought in 1939 and early 1940. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for watching.